counters even underneath what they use for a counter now.
Right, and the ceiling, that formica or whatever that paneling is in the ceiling seems to be somewhat original too.
Yeah, even the light fixtures on the ceiling are original. With booths and stools, you could essentially start up another diner in there.
Yeah. That had to be, I think, one of the local places where people would come to have a dinner every now and again. I know that as a young man, we used to go down every Thursday night. There was what they call the 99-cent special at the Beverly Diner. And for 99 cents, you would get a beverage, full course meal, and a dessert.
Right.
Without even having to pay a tax in those days. It was just simply a 99-cent
It was under a
dinner.
buck.
It was under a buck, right. They knew how to, because that would actually influence someone in those days.
Sure would. Yeah. It's like 1995 today. Everything on TV is 1995 because you're under that $20 magic figure.
Right.
I remember when I was in high school, I worked part-time at the First National Supermarket right up the street from there. And on Friday evenings, I had to work until 9 o'clock. And at 5:30, they would give you a half-hour supper break, and I'd run down to the Miss Beverly. And one dish that I remember in particular that I had very often was ravioli and meat cakes. And again, it was that 99-cent special, I believe. And you wolfed it down in 10 minutes and hoofed it back, and you get back before your break was over.
Yeah.
And it was great. I did it for at least 2 years.
Well, it was the original fast food restaurant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Al was the thin fellow, right? He was
I really don't know what the owner looked like. I'd never met him.
We don't have any pictures of any of these people, unfortunately, do we, Gary?
No, not that I know of.
Folks who used to go there will just have to remember as best they can as to who these people were, unfortunately. But, speaking of the Miss Beverly Diner, it was a safe place to go. I mean, if you were a young man or a young lady, you were in high school or so, it was always a nice place to drop in for a cup of coffee or a piece of pie, if not a full dinner.
Yeah.
And the prices were right, Gary.
Right.
And the crossing tender for the railroad was right backed up to the building. And he would, in off moments, dash in there and have a cup of coffee or take it back to his little shanty.
It's interesting to note, though, how many of these places stopped serving 24 hours a day in the 50s and 60s. And a lot of them were getting just annoyed with the people that would come out of bars when they closed. And it was just getting to be too much for most of them.
Yeah. Now, the Miss Beverly was never open all night, was it? To my recollection, I don't recall it being open.
It was open till like 9 o'clock or something.
Yeah, maybe a little later on the weekends.
Yeah, maybe later on the weekends.
Yeah. There weren't many in Beverly, I think, that were 24-hour. There just wasn't a call for it.
No. Well, for that matter, Beverly hasn't had that many diners over the last 90 years.
No.
We're talking about the early days on Rantoul Street.
Right.
But they were just a kind of a here today and gone tomorrow kind of a situation.
Right. Yeah. The only one I know of that was 24-hour, we're actually coming up on pretty soon. But that was very early on, when there were probably different shifts at some of the factories downtown.
Which would be, which one are you referring to?
It would have been the Columbian Lunch Wagon on Rantoul Street.
Okay. All right. Let's, unless we have some more to say about the Miss Beverly Diner, have we covered that?
I think we have.
Okay, we're going to go up to 139 Elliott Street, Gary. By the way, we're talking with Gary Thomas here, who is the caretaker of the Diner Collection, which is contained within the Walker Transportation Collection, which Mr. Richard Symmes is the curator of, ladies and gentlemen. 139 Elliott Street.
Okay, here's another one. We don't know a lot about the people that ran it, or that much, but it's for the limited time it was there, from 1911 to 1918 or so. We do actually have an image of it, and it was one of the White House cafes, probably built in Worcester or in Lynn, where there was a man who shared the patent who manufactured them over in Lynn.
I see.
His name was Ephraim Hamill, or a man named Charles Buckley, who was known as the Lunch Wagon King. And he was one of the more prolific builders, and actually probably one of the more flamboyant. He really saw the potential in these and marketed them well. He would go to the different towns where someone was applying for the licenses to be able to run them, and he'd appear before the numerous town meetings and extol the virtues of these little eateries.
So an advocate, sort of, in those days.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And a man with a social conscience, too. He also sold them to some of the temperance organizations. And so they could compete with the saloons for the people's dime. So instead of getting a glass of beer and a hot dog for a dime, they'd give you a better meal without the liquor. But that was not so much in this area as more the bigger cities that you'd see those.
I could see this one at 139 Elliott Street catering to a bit of the shoe people trade.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, they'd be close enough for that.
Yeah, that would have
entice
been
a few people out of the factory for a lunch.
Yeah, that was right on the corner of Beckford Street. It had served as the parking lot for Reed Brothers Machine Company for a while.
Yeah, I see. Okay, now we're going to move up to 8464 Red Tool Street, Gary.
Right, this is the one that I mentioned that had actually been opened 24 hours a day at one time. And that again, this too was a Buckley wagon, I believe, one of the very later models. I think Mr. Buckley had actually died by the time this came to Beverly. And interestingly enough, going along with the Walker Transportation Collection, his company had also manufactured electric cars too, I believe after his death, but sort of a natural sort of
tie in there with that, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And the years were 1912 through...
Well, this one is a traveled wagon within Beverly.
1912 through 27 with various ownerships involved.
Right.
Yeah.
And it must have been a half-decent spot because, the people that ran it were there for a number of years, each one.
Now, are we talking next to where the Gateway Apartments would be today?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's funny because in the image that we have of it, you can even see the building where I believe is Mike's restaurant now.
Right.
You see that in the background. And kind of a curious configuration for this diner in that it had a horseshoe-shaped counter. According to Dorothy Du Bois, who had run it when it was at 188 Rantoul Street some years later, it was moved down next to Weiner Brothers Hardware in the 20s and operated there probably till the late 50s when they replaced it with a bigger diner that everyone remembers, I think, as the post office diner.
Sure.
And eventually that diner was moved back onto Park Street.
Yeah. No, this is at 188 Rantoul Street.
Right.
Which was to become the post office diner, Gary?
Right.
The first
location.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, there are a number of folks here that were involved with this enterprise.
Yeah, and I think it must have been, I don't know, for some years here it was not obviously a very good spot. It had probably, 6 different owners in a course of about 10 years.
You want to skim down through the ownerships just quickly for people who might recall some of these names?
1931 to 32, a John Logan. In 1933, Daniel Lyons. 1938 to 41, Samuel Ware. 1942, George Ristoff and Mary Dennis. Vacant from 1943 to 44. 1946 to 47, Frank Schilling, which is a name that has popped up in many of my researches about these diners in Gloucester, Salem, Beverly, Lynn. He was quite a mover and shaker in that business, I guess. In 1949, we have Robert MacArthur, and Douglas Evans. And in 1949 to 57, Douglas Evans and his wife Gertrude. And finally, 1958 to 62, Eugene and Dorothy Du Bois. And it eventually moved to Park Street, which is now the parking lot for the French Club. And the Du Boises ran that there until 1975. And finally, George Carnevale, he ran it there until it was torn down in 1987. And recently at the American Diner Museum, we were donated 1/2 of the sign that was at the post office diner. And the museum will eventually be set up in Providence, and we plan on having a whole wall of just signs from different diners from all over the country.
And we're looking at that right now on the screen.
Right. And I think that should be quite a sight.
Right. We were going to bring it in here, Richard, but we thought that within the John Cabot room here it would be kind of out of place.
Look a little bit tacky.
Yeah. But like I said, the Diner Museum is quite a venture in itself.
I bet it is.
It's an all-volunteer organization at this time, basically to preserve what we can of this sort of unique bit of Americana. Mm-hmm. And so we're collecting everything we can, and anyone that has anything they would like to contribute to the Walker collection or to the Diner Museum itself, that's...
Amen.
So we're saying here the post office diner, which was last to be seen at 45 Park Street, was really the last of its kind in Beverly. Would you say that would be a...
Yeah, except for the Miss Beverly, sure. But it was the last functioning diner.
Diner in Beverly.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you'd call Buffalo Bill's a diner or not, but it's it has that same, probably that same flavor to it.
Yeah, that's pretty much just roast beef sandwiches and that kind of thing.
Right.
Subs.
I mean, architecturally,
it's
a diner, but...
Even though you can't tell from the outside unless you really know what diners look like, you'd never probably guess, especially today's generation.
Yeah.
Right.
And I know that the post office diner, the name itself, many of the employees from the post office would go over there for lunch and and whatnot, you know. Mm-hmm. But of course, along came Bora's down there on the corner of Broadway and Rantoul Street, and I'm sure that had taken away some of the business that the post office diner may have had.
That's right, because Bora's is almost a diner in a card shop, if you want to call it that, because you go in there and it's a long counter and half a dozen tables, which were like booths, and it's essentially a diner.
Yeah.
Right.
Same
it really
menu.
is. Yeah, absolutely.
Beverly does have one sort of a very, very small diner that rolls its streets once in a while. That being a truck that a local fella has outfitted, and he has a sort of mock diner set up in the back of his truck. So that's kind of a fun thing that he sets up at car shows. And,
I think I've seen that.
Right.
Yeah.
This must be a seasonal thing, though, for him to do that. I'm sure he doesn't
He doesn't do it much in the
go about
winter.
full time.
No,
Yeah.
it's a very nice looking truck with very low mileage, so he does what he can to protect it.
That doesn't go out in bad weather.
His name, by the way, is Frank Costa.
Frank Costa.
Yeah.
Okay. Seems to me, Richard, that the concept of the diner is kind of disappearing across the land. Would you say, Richard or Gary, that might be so? I mean, take here in Beverly, we were, at one time we had two or three working diners, but they're gone.
Yeah. Well, in Essex County, probably at the peak, there were probably 140 diners around 1935. And today there are probably 19. And a lot of those aren't even open, or they're not serving traditional diner food.
Right.
But
Any reason for that, Gary? Would you say?
actually, the number's been holding steady. I think the popularity is rising again. simply because it's just basic home-cooked food at a pretty reasonable price. And people these days are looking for value wherever they can find it.
You're looking for something different from, the fast food places that we all know and love.
Right.
Yeah.
And people do appreciate a little bit of that old-time feel
Yeah,
that the
there's an
diner will
atmosphere.
have.
There definitely is an atmosphere that you don't get in a fast food place.
Right.
Yeah.
But, and actually we've had a diner added to our area in the not too distant past, which was Chubby's Diner in Salisbury just last year. And that was a very old diner that was installed up there.
Yeah. Hard work though, Richard, to operate a diner.
It's got to be a labor of love because, the fact that it's a unique business means you got to work that much harder to make a go of it. And there's so much competition, as Gary's just alluded to, with all your fast food places, that you really have to have some kind of a hook to get people to come in and keep coming in, because there's not the manufacturing that you had years ago that gave you a steady trade of blue-collar clientele. So now you've got to have some other kind of an edge. Truckers have their own places to go pretty much, and a lot of these aren't on interstates, certainly. Well, that's where all the trucks are today, so it's not that either. So it's something else, and I think, as he said, people are discovering this and saying, gee, this is pretty unique, and wouldn't it be nice to have some of these still around, so that when they do find them, they tend to go and patronize them. Now, how long this is going to last before the next fad comes along, it's hard to say, but for now, certainly things are looking up.
Have the McDonald's or the Burger Kings taken away the trade, do you think, Gary, to an extent?
Well, I think the best evidence of that is right up in Rowley at the Agawam Diner, across the street from McDonald's, and you'll usually find more cars in the diner's parking lot than McDonald's.
Yeah.
And you can't get into the Agawam on weekends. There's a line out the door and down the steps, and there's a 15-20 minute wait almost any time you show up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, you're talking about an establishment that's been there for years and years. It's built up a clientele, reputation. And as you just alluded to a moment ago, that's what you need to be successful, I would assume, is to have that patronage, that following.
Right. But their real stock in trade is the consistency up there. And I think every diner, although they can't make everything themselves, they pick different things. They're especially known for their baked goods. Mm-hmm. Another diner might be known for always having real gravy and real mashed potatoes. You have to pick some aspect of it that you want to concentrate on.
That's right.
Plain as it was, I could still see that big bowl of Jell-O with the huge mounds of whipped cream on it, Miss Bevel. That used to be my favorite after the dinner, after the 99-cent special.
Sure.
Yep.
In the remaining few minutes that we have, gentlemen, could we just mention briefly a few of the other diners in the immediate surrounding area, both past and present? And let's start with the old diner that sat in Depot Square in Hamilton, Gary.
Okay, yeah, that was the Hamilton Diner, and it was originally set up by a man named Armstrong, and that was probably 1929, I believe. And he ran that for a few years, and it was eventually taken over by a man named Foote. And
Louis Foote.
Louis Foote. And he ran that for quite a few years. And it was just a tiny little thing right in front of where Talbot's is now.
Between Talbot's and the old trade station that used to sit there in the old building.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Kind of wedged in there.
Yeah.
Right.
Louis, I'm told, used to be a wrestler. Used to wrestle over at the North End Arena, I guess, over there in Salem. On his spare time. So I would guess you would want to fool around when you went into the diner, Richard.
You didn't complain about the food.
But that diner ended up in Middleton, up at Richardson's Dairy, of all places, and it was used as a place for the workers to eat, known as the Beanery. And eventually just fell into disrepair and was torn down.
Yeah. How about the one over at Danversport?
Danversport, that, as anyone can pretty plainly see on the outside, if it was from the Cape Ann area, used to be on Main Street in Gloucester. And that was moved there in 1959. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the stipulations that it had to leave Gloucester by its former owner, because he was installing a new diner down there, and if someone wanted to buy his old diner, he had to take it out of town. It was brought there by a man named Bill Madden, and it was actually owned by the same man that owned the Hesperus Diner in Gloucester when it was there. Nice diner, though. That one's
Excellent
really
diner.
good shape.
Good food there. Too.
Oh yeah, they have a meatloaf you wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
Have you
Oh
frequented
yeah,
the place, Richard?
yeah, we go in there quite often.
Do you?
Yeah.
Well, let's try this diner down at Bridge Street over at Salem. Was it Karen's Diner?
Karen's Diner, right. That was run by the Karen family of Salem. And that was the original Ann's Diner up in Salisbury. They replaced that one in 1949, and so they sent the diner up here to Salem, and it became Karen's. And that was one that had a lot of great stories. I talked with Bernie Karen, who used to, his family used to run it, and he had wonderful stories about, well, one time one of his friends came in and saw a whole counter full of midgets on the stools, and he just took one look and walked out. He said, "Not tonight." And they were apparently just, you know, people employed for the show at the North Shore Music Theater.
Sure.
Yeah, but that diner was torn down in the early 70s.
Yeah. That was one that stayed open rather late at night. I can recall going in there for coffee and whatnot
Yeah, we went there.
past the hour of midnight.
Yeah, we went there with the National Guard one time when we were leaving for Camp Drum for the annual summer training, and they brought in a whole company from the Salem Armory at 4:30 in the morning, and they opened up special at that hour to accommodate them, and I can still remember those greasy fried potatoes. And we had to bounce in those Army trucks all the way out to New York State that day, and boy, I'll tell you, you regretted some of that stuff later as the day wore on.
Good.
I recall going to Salem Teachers College back in the mid-50s. We couldn't stand the food that they were serving in the cafeteria at that time, so we used to eat down at the Salem Diner, down the foot of Laurie Avenue, I believe, by the old, was it Sylvania?
Right.
Plant down
Right
there.
across the street.
And that was a favorite, very popular place at that time, late 50s.
Yeah.
I assume it's still there today.
Oh yeah, yeah. That diner was built right up in Merrimack.
That's a Sterling Streamliner, is that
That's
correct?
right.
And it's built to look like the Art Deco streamlined trains of the 1930s with a sloping back.
Exactly. Story has it that when it was installed, the man who installed it there walked across the street with the keys and dumped them in the sewer, saying his diner would be open 24 hours a day and he didn't need them.
Wonderful.
They put on a good meal too. We've eaten there many times. Yeah.
Gary and Richard, we're down to about 3 minutes here or less. How can we sum this up now in terms of, shall we say, the situation today that concerns diners? Are they still alive and thriving?
It seems to be a bit of a following now, especially younger people are picking it up now.
Making a comeback?
Yes, I think so. And I know that there's more active new diner manufacturers than there ever were before, and that's a good sign. So
See,
it is.
there's even a newsletter and that sort of thing that goes out pretty much nationally, right, that concerns the diner business.
Yeah, Roadside Magazine, and that has quite a following too. But I think it's looking up, and you know, as far as the museum goes, we figure if they can be viable businesses, all the better. It's less to have to try and preserve.
Right. Now, as the caretaker of the collection here within the Walker Transportation Collection, what would you like to see? Would you like people to come visit? Would you like people to donate? Obviously, you would like that, I'm sure.
Well, we always like to see new material coming around, but like Richard would tell you, anyone's welcome down here. Any Wednesday night
Any
we're
Wednesday.
here, or appointments.
Got lots of pictures.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, that people who may see this program, if any of them perhaps had worked in a diner locally or know of people who have worked, you'd be interested in contacting these people.
Oh, yeah, we're always interested in people's recollections of their work and even their visits to different diners, because nobody knows it all, and we're always willing to, you know, talk to new people about this subject.
Right. And going back to the beginning of our little discussion here, the earliest lunch wagons, of course, you were able to come up with this information by going through the various city directories of those years.
Right.
back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And
Yeah, that's a treasure trove of information, the city directories, and we have them right in the next room here in the society.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both of you gentlemen. Richard, of course, is my co-host of the World War II series that we do and does a marvelous job. And Gary, perhaps we could, if it's at all possible, we might be able to gather a few people together who have worked in diners who may have some stories to tell about them.
Yeah.
And I'll leave that up to your discretion if this can be arranged, why we would indeed like to have a part 2 of this series.
That may be a very good thing to do.
Very good. So we'll see how that sets. Speaking of sitting here we are, Richard, right behind you. There's a Gilbert Stuart painting here of Moses Brown and a Frothingham painting next to it. Quite a place, this George Cabot
An
House.
1828 Chickering spinet piano, which is all restored and plays just as nicely as it did when it was built.
Great. And your gang, as we said at the beginning of the program, is downstairs right now.
They're being very quiet.
Having been told by their master to
They're being
knock
very
off
quiet.
the noise.
That's right, or else.
Okay. Well, we thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for sitting with us this evening. And this is Ed Josephs signing off for this edition of Beverly's Times Past.